I've actually renamed the talk How the West Was Won and Australia's Part in It. On the 26th of January 1885 at Khartoum in the Sudan, British General Charles Chinese Gordon was speared and mutilated by the followers of the Mahdi, a fanatical Islamist leader who claimed to be the expected one, who would, near the end of days, unite all Muslims in the world and destroy the infidel. The Mahdi, Muhammad Ahmad, declared war on Western civilization as well as the Ottoman Empire. When news of General Gordon's death reached Sydney, a volunteer corps, the New South Wales contingent, was formed, and 200,000 people watched it embark from Circular Quay. Unfortunately for the Mahdi, his plans for world conquest were dashed when only 6 months after Gordon's death, he was struck down by typhus. Great Britain's attention was then diverted away to Afghanistan because of the Russian threat. But the job was finished in 1898 when Lord Kitchener's British-Egyptian force defeated the Mahdist movement at Omdurman. The original Mahdi's tomb was blown up and his remains were burnt and scattered in the Nile so that nothing physical would be left as a rallying point. At Omdurman, a young Englishman, Captain Neville Smythe, risked his life to save journalists who were being attacked by a Mahdist warrior. Though wounded, he killed the attacker and earned a Victoria Cross. A year later, he led a party that tracked down and captured one of the Mahdi's successors, the Khalifa al-Sharif, and two of the Mahdi's sons. Having tried them, he ordered their execution and had their remains put into the Nile to prevent their being canonised. During that engagement, Smythe saved the life of one of his Muslim junior officers who fought alongside him against the extremist. Soon afterwards, another of the Mahdi's successors, Khalifa Abdul ibn Muhammad, fell in a hail of bullets, and Smythe was ordered to ride into the desert with his head and to bury it at a secret location. The Islamist movement fell apart after that, but with the benefit of hindsight, Kitchener spoke too soon when, in his Mission Accomplished report, he said that Mahdism is now a thing of the past, and I hope that a brighter era has at length opened up for the Sudan. It is estimated that 1 to 2 million people have died of war and famine in the Sudan during the last 3 decades. Osama bin Laden was based there before his move to greener pastures in the Taliban's Afghanistan, from whence he planned his assault on Western civilization. In the early days after the tragic events of September 11, 2001, an act that caused Prime Minister John Howard to commit Australia to the fight against yet another fanatical Islamist creed, Al-Qaeda, there was considerable speculation about whether bin Laden would declare himself the Mahdi. 10 years later, and over 100 years after Sir Neville Smythe's adventures in the Sudan, US Navy SEAL Team 6 raided a compound in Pakistan, which resulted in the death of the latest would-be Mahdi. Just as in 1898-99, when the Mahdi's and the Khalifa's remains had been cast into the Nile or buried at secret location in the desert, Osama bin Laden's body was buried at sea. Like Smythe VC, who saved the life of a Muslim subaltern only 2 years ago, Australian SAS trooper Mark Donaldson saved the life of a Muslim interpreter who was assisting in the battle against the Taliban. And he earned a VC in the process. So it does seem that history repeats itself. During World War I, Smythe commanded the 1st Australian Infantry Brigade at Gallipoli, and later still, the 2nd Australian Division at the Western Front. He migrated to Australia in 1924, and he was so impressed by the spirit of the Australian troops in World War I that he wanted to become one of them. His son, Dacre, later joined the Royal Australian Navy and saw action at the Battle of the Coral Sea and at the Normandy invasion. And Smythe's grandson still lives in Melbourne. and a statue of Gordon is only 2 blocks down the street from where we are right now. These events and the story of the Smythe family serve to remind us that Western civilization, together with Muslim allies, have battled Islamist extremism throughout the last 3 centuries, and that it is not over yet. They also remind us of the close cultural, institutional and military links that have bound Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States during that period. When Great Britain was challenged by Prussian militarism in 1914, Labor Prime Minister Andrew Fisher declared that Australia would be fighting to the last shilling. However, the war divided Australians into pro- and anti-conscriptionists and split the Labor Party. It also split families, like that of Albert Jacka, the first Australian VC winner during the war. His father, Nathaniel, was a Labor Party stalwart who campaigned against conscription and did the rounds of the country towns in the company of Ben Chifley. At the Melbourne Town Hall in 1916, Nathaniel Jacka stated that, quote, "A yes vote would put Australia under the iron heel of Prussianism and under the mailed fist of capitalism." By contrast, during the second conscription referendum debate in 1917, the Argus published an extract of a letter from his son, Albert Jacka, commenting that people who voted no do not, quote, "realise the great issue that is at stake." At the conclusion of the war, the editorial of Australia's Argus was very clear on what great issue was at stake during the war. I quote, "Upon the result of the war hung the future of our Western civilization, that great heritage of intellectual, artistic and spiritual attainments, the foundations of which were laid by the Mediterranean races in the dim past." By 1936, the transparent evils of fascism and the even more transparent evils of the Great Depression had pushed to the left many former diggers who had witnessed the horrors of the Great War. And Albert Jacka's brother Bill was one of these. In a pamphlet published in 1936 by the Communist Front organisation, the League for Peace and Democracy, after acknowledging the superb courage of the Australian and New Zealand soldiers at Anzac, he made an appeal to Australians to, quote, "not allow your determination and heroism to be prostituted by the masters of the old world, whose only God is profit. Display your courage by refusing to fight in imperialist war under any pretext whatever, and join with those who fight only in the cause of peace." This worldview held that wars could be averted by getting rid of their root cause, i.e. capitalist imperialists. Try telling that to the Mensheviks of 1917 or the Vietnamese, Chinese and Cambodians of 1979. There are no prizes for guessing who was fighting only in the cause of peace in 1936. In the first months of World War II, Professor, later Sir Walter Murdoch, explained in the Australian press that the fight is for Western civilization. A professor of literature at the University of Western Australia, he was a widely syndicated columnist and was Sir Keith Murdoch's uncle. To give you some idea of his grit, when lying on his deathbed, upon being told that a university would be named after him, he replied, "It had better be a good one." Murdoch quoted the legendary Dorothy Thompson, who was the first American journalist to be deported from Nazi Germany in 1934. Her common characteristics of Western civilization were: 1, the Christian ethic, that the weak have rights as well as the strong, and that the strong must set limitations upon their power. 2, the scientific spirit, that the search for truth transcends the state and may not be limited or suppressed by the state. 3, the rule of law, under which there is a separation of state and culture. Where there is a separation of culture from force, the contract is superior to arbitrary force, and no one, not the king nor the president, is above the rule of law. Another characteristic noted by Clash of Civilizations author Samuel P. Huntington, is individualism. The individualism of the Australian diggers in the Great War is legendary, but it is a trait that is not unique to Australians. A recent international analysis of individualism found that the US currently scores highest with an index value of 91, while Australians and Britons are right up there with scores of 90 and 89 respectively, which is probably statistically indistinguishable. This contrasts with the marked collectivism and the tendencies in the Islamic world, where the average score is 32 on that scale. So individualism is a sufficient but not totally necessary condition for democracy if you have a look at those scores against the Freedom House ratings of democracy. Australians had previously written to Murdoch and informed him that Germany was a civilised country, and therefore any reference to the war as a defence of Western civilisation was nonsensical. However, Murdoch drew the distinction between the spiritual concept of Western civilisation and merely possessing some of the material indicators associated with civilisation. Murdoch conceded that while Nazi Germany had many of the material characteristics of civilised society, it had nonetheless declared war on Western civilisation by abrogating the rule of universal law and had persecuted the weak with utter savagery. It had made one law for the German and another for a Jew, a Czech or a Pole, putting men to death without the pretense of a trial. In doing so, Nazi Germany had betrayed the great tradition of the German people. As Murdoch put it, quote, "We are fighting in defence of a civilisation which, with all its defects, has raised man's life on earth to higher heights, material and spiritual, than the world has ever known before, and which contains in it the promise and the potency of the highest life we can conceive." Having defeated fascism in 1945, the West stepped straight into the Cold War with the communists, which raged from 1946 to 1989. Australia participated through its involvement in Malaya, Korea, and Vietnam. And in the latter conflict, there was a division again on conscription, just as in World War I. The slogan, "Better red than dead," was heard, just as some Frenchmen, presumably the future Vichy, had said "better German than dead" in the 1930s. In the last 50 years, the Islamic world has had a disproportionate involvement in costly wars, with large numbers of underemployed and disenchanted youth, fundamentalist dogma, and poverty, creating conditions that have favoured autocracy, terrorism, and armed conflict. On the other hand, there is now a growing population of educated youth in the Middle East. In recent months, we have witnessed the Arab Spring uprisings across the Middle East, which is also known as the Twitter and Facebook revolutions. As Asia industrialises and urbanises, the balance of world power is shifting, as we heard earlier. 70% of Australia's exports now go to Asia, mainly to China, and this proportion will continue to rise. It is predicted that by 2020, China will overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. And some economists are saying that by 2050, India will overtake China. The bad news is, as noted in Geoffrey Blainey's book, The Causes of War, that rapid growth in economic power often creates a hubris that increases the chance of war. Next month, the United States and Vietnam will conduct joint naval exercises, which will add to the tension that is currently building in the South China Sea. In summary, while Australia, as we know it, was not around for the battles of Marathon, Salamis, Tours, Lepanto, and Vienna, where the West was won, since the 1885 expedition to the Sudan, Australians have fought in all four of the great conflicts for Western civilisation during the last century, which Andrew Roberts has identified as Prussian militarism, fascism, communism, and Islamist fundamentalism. The battle against Islamist fundamentalism will continue, and the recent Australian Defence White Paper has identified China as a potential threat. Brigadier John Fruin of the Australian Army has famously hypothesised that in any potential future conflict between the United States and China, if Australia is aligned with the former, it could find itself the martyr in the middle, torn between the security benefits of continued alliance with the core state of Western civilization on the one hand, and neutrality or self-defence sufficiency on the other, to reap the benefits of trade links with an alternative civilization. While, as Paul Monk has stated in a recent thought piece, a cold or hot war is not an inevitable consequence of China's rise as world power, it should not be ruled out as a possibility. Clearly, during the next couple of decades, Australians will live through uncertain and interesting times, which apparently is not a Chinese proverb or curse. And once again, the idea of Western civilization will be put to the test. Thank you.